The pipeline is gone. That is the first thing you notice. Not the road. The road has been gone for a while now. But the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, that massive steel corridor that runs alongside the Dalton Highway for most of its 414 miles, the one thing you could always see in the dark and the snow, the one fixed reference point that tells you roughly where the road should be. It has vanished too. You are somewhere north of Atigun Pass, somewhere in the stretch between mile 362 and the coastal plain. And the storm coming off the Brooks Range has turned the world into a single, undifferentiated surface of white. No horizon, no edge, no road, no pipeline, nothing but the sound of the wind and the weight of 60,000 pounds of cargo, and the faint, insistent question that every driver in this situation eventually faces: where exactly am I? And which direction is forward? This is not a hypothetical. On the Dalton Highway, Alaska's remote gravel artery connecting Fairbanks to the oil fields at Prudhoe Bay, the road that exists because the Trans-Alaska Pipeline needed to be built and the North Slope needed to be supplied. Complete whiteouts above the Brooks Range are not unusual events. They are a seasonal condition. The Alaska DOT and Public Facilities has documented that north of Atigun Pass, from milepost 362 to milepost 414, whiteout conditions can make the road entirely impossible to see. In 2019, the state installed a dedicated system of road delineators across that stretch. Sturdy vertical markers planted on either side of the gravel to mark its edges. Specifically because the problem of navigating that corridor in zero visibility had become serious enough to demand a structural solution. But the delineators are only as useful as a driver's ability to see them. And in the worst storms, even those markers disappear. If you watch this channel from your television, thank you. Most of our viewers do. If you can, please subscribe and share this video with someone who might appreciate it. It costs nothing, and it means everything to the future of what we're building here. Understanding what happens when a truck driver loses the road requires understanding what the road actually is on the Dalton, and what it is not. For most of its length, the Dalton is a gravel surface 28 feet wide, running through some of the most completely uninhabited terrain in North America. There are no cities. There are no suburbs. There are no highway overpasses or on-ramps or interchange markers to serve as visual anchors. Between Coldfoot at mile 175, the northernmost truck stop on the continent, and Dead Horse at mile 414, there are no fuel stations, no restaurants, no mechanics, and no paved shoulders. The road exists as a narrow corridor scraped and maintained through tundra, permafrost, and mountain terrain, running alongside the pipeline for much of its northern length. In dry weather with good visibility, experienced drivers treat it as a demanding but navigable route. In a serious Arctic storm, it becomes something qualitatively different. A road that disappears not just from sight, but from every intuitive assumption about what a road is supposed to look like. The Dalton carries approximately 160 trucks per day in summer and around 250 per day in winter, when the oil fields need more fuel and supplies to operate through the cold. Those numbers are not large by the standards of any major highway, but they represent real freight moving across real terrain in real weather. And the people moving it are professionals whose understanding of this particular road is built from years of specific accumulated experience. Drivers for carriers like Carlisle Transportation, Linden Transport, Alaska West Express, and 49th Freight run this route regularly. They know its landmarks, its grades, its danger zones, and its rhythms in a way that cannot be downloaded or abbreviated. And when visibility drops to zero, it is that knowledge, not any piece of technology, that becomes the primary navigation system. Here is the first thing most people misunderstand about navigation in zero visibility on the Dalton. GPS does not solve this problem. That assumption is worth examining carefully, because it runs counter to how most people think about navigation in the modern era. We live in a world where getting lost in a city feels almost impossible, where your phone can tell you to turn left in 300 feet with enough accuracy to find a specific parking space. It is natural to assume that GPS removes the navigation problem from extreme environments entirely. It does not. Above the Arctic Circle, which the Dalton crosses at mile 115.5, GPS satellite geometry degrades in ways that have nothing to do with the quality of a driver's receiver. The GPS constellation orbits at an inclination of roughly 55 degrees relative to the equator, which means that at high latitudes, no satellite ever passes directly overhead. By the time you reach the Arctic Circle and beyond, the highest any GPS satellite will appear in the sky is about 45 degrees above the horizon. This geometry reduces vertical accuracy. The system is less able to precisely determine your elevation relative to the ground. And in the conditions where that matters most, when a storm is rerouting gravel and snow across the road surface, and the physical edge of the pavement is invisible, vertical positioning uncertainty can translate into real spatial ambiguity about whether a truck is on the road or beside it. Beyond the geometry problem, the Arctic is also subject to ionospheric scintillation, rapid fluctuations in the radio frequency signals that GPS satellites transmit, caused by disturbances in the charged layer of the upper atmosphere near the poles. During geomagnetic storm events, which occur when solar activity disturbs Earth's magnetic field, those fluctuations can cause GPS receivers to lose satellite lock entirely, producing positioning gaps that last seconds or minutes at a time. A truck moving at walking speed across a road that may or may not still be beneath its wheels does not have seconds to spare. And even when GPS is functioning correctly, it tells a driver where they are at a point in space. It does not tell them where the edge of the road is. It does not tell them whether the gravel surface they are on is the road surface or the tundra 6 inches to the right of it. The map and the ground are two different things. And in a full whiteout, the gap between them becomes the only thing that matters. Standard consumer GPS navigation applications compound this further. Multiple experienced Dalton travelers and guides note that navigation apps become unreliable past the Yukon River at mile 56. The road exists in those applications as a line on a map. The map does not update in real time to reflect where snow has drifted across the surface, where the gravel has shifted under a week of heavy freight traffic, or where the road edge has eroded to within inches of a drainage ditch that is now buried under 3 feet of wind-packed snow. Commercial trucking GPS systems are more sophisticated than consumer applications and include real-time dispatch and position tracking through systems like Motive and Samsara, which carriers use to monitor driver location and safety status. But those systems are fleet management tools, not road-finding tools. They tell a dispatcher in Fairbanks or Anchorage where a truck is on the map. They do not tell the driver in the cab where the road is under the white. So if GPS is insufficient, what does a driver actually use? The answer is a layered system of physical reading, trained instinct, mechanical feedback, and communication that has no single name but that experienced Arctic truckers develop over years of running these routes. And it begins with something so fundamental that it almost seems too simple to be a survival technique: knowing the road. Every section of the Dalton has a character that experienced drivers carry in their memory like a detailed internal map. The forested stretch south of the Yukon River feels different from the open tundra north of Coldfoot. The approach to Atigan Pass, with its steep grades and tight curves through the Brooks Range, feels different from the long flat exposure of the north slope beyond it. Gobbler's Knob at mile 132, Finger Mountain at mile 98, Franklin Bluff south of Dead Horse, the roller coaster grades, Beaver Slide. These are not just names on a map to the drivers who run this road regularly. They are tactile memories, sequences of steering input, throttle adjustment, and road behavior that a driver's body remembers even when their eyes are providing no information. The Dalton is 28 feet wide for most of its length, which means that a driver who knows the feel of the road, the slight camber, the drainage crown, the texture of the gravel under the tires, can sometimes detect when they are drifting toward an edge even before any visual information confirms it. This is not guesswork. It is a specific kind of physical attention that experienced drivers describe as listening to the truck. The way the steering feels when front tires cross from packed gravel to soft shoulder, the way the trailer responds to a surface change, The sound that changes when tires hit the corrugated rumble strips that Alaska DOT installs at road edges specifically to provide this kind of tactile warning. Milled-in rumble strips ground into the road surface create a vibration that is physically unmistakable inside a cab, a sensation that cuts through noise and fatigue and darkness to tell a driver that the edge of the road is immediately to one side. Alaska DOT documents that these strips are installed on rural highways specifically to warn drivers leaving the travel lane. And on the Dalton, where leaving the travel lane in a whiteout can mean dropping off a road edge into drainage terrain that may not be visible for another mile. That warning is not an amenity. It is a critical piece of the navigation system. But knowing the road and feeling the road's edges only gets a driver so far in a true whiteout. At some point, the knowledge runs out. The storm doesn't care how many years a driver has run the haul road. And this is where the second layer of navigation takes over: communication. CB radio is the communication fabric of the Dalton Highway, and it serves a function on this road that goes well beyond the trucker culture shorthand most people associate with the technology. On a highway with no cell coverage through most of its length, CB radio is the primary medium through which drivers exchange real-time information about conditions. A northbound driver who has just come through a stretch of road that is barely visible will broadcast that information on Channel 19, the standard trucking channel, to southbound drivers who haven't reached it yet. A driver who has stopped because a section ahead is completely impassable will call out their position and the reason for the stop, so that the next truck behind them doesn't drive into the back of a stationary vehicle they cannot see until they are already too close. This communication forms a moving, constantly updated picture of conditions that no satellite can provide, because it is assembled in real time by the people who are physically present on the road. The pipeline itself, the 48-inch diameter steel tube of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, which carries crude oil from Prudhoe Bay south to Valdez, serves as a navigation reference in a way that most people who have never driven the Dalton would not anticipate. For much of the Dalton's length, the pipeline runs closely alongside the road, sometimes visible on elevated supports, sometimes following a slightly different grade, but always nearby. Drivers who know the road know approximately where the pipeline should be relative to the road at any given mile marker. When visibility drops, the pipeline provides a directional reference that can sometimes be seen through conditions that have erased the road surface itself. Its elevated sections and pipe supports rising above the grade-level snow in a way that a flat road surface cannot. On the exposed north slope, above the Brooks Range, the pipeline's route and the road's route diverge somewhat, and that landmark becomes less reliable. But in the mountain corridor, the pipeline and the road travel together, and experienced drivers use the pipeline as one more data point in the composite navigation picture they are assembling from everything available. The delineator posts installed by Alaska DOT in 2019 between miles 362 and 414 represent the most recent engineered response to the navigation problem on that exposed coastal plain stretch. These are not simple reflective stakes. They are sturdy vertical markers designed to remain visible through conditions that erase horizontal surfaces, planted on both sides of the road at intervals intended to allow a driver to see the next marker before losing sight of the last one. In theory, creating a navigable visual corridor even when the road itself cannot be distinguished from the surrounding tundra. The project was specifically designed and tested for that stretch because the coastal plain above the Brooks Range offers no natural landmarks whatsoever. South of the pass, in the Brooks Range corridor, a driver can use the mountain terrain itself, a ridge, a valley wall, a creek drainage, as a rough directional reference. North of the pass, the coastal plain is flat in every direction for miles, and in a full whiteout, it becomes one of the most disorienting environments on Earth. There is no up, there is no down, there is no forward. The sky and the ground and everything between them merge into a single white surface, and the only thing that can interrupt it is a delineator post appearing in the headlights at what feels like the last possible moment before driving past it. At speeds that most drivers south of Fairbanks would find uncomfortably slow, sometimes as low as 5 or 10 miles per hour. A Dalton driver in those conditions is making micro-corrections based on delineator position, tactile feedback, CB communication, odometer reading, and memory, all at once. Every one of those channels provides partial information. None of them provides complete information. The skill is in integrating them into a decision that keeps 60,000 pounds of truck and cargo on a 28-foot road when the 28-foot road is invisible. There is a technique that drivers use in extreme conditions that is almost never discussed outside the trucking community. And that represents a kind of operational wisdom that can only be built by experience on a specific route. It is sometimes called dead reckoning by the people who practice it, borrowed from the old maritime navigation term for estimating position based on known starting point, speed, direction, and elapsed time. On the Dalton, it works roughly like this. A driver knows from memory that they crossed a specific landmark, a bridge, a pipeline support structure, a creek drainage, a certain number of minutes ago at a certain speed in a certain direction. From that, they can calculate approximately where they should be now and what the road should be doing, curving left, running straight, beginning a grade. At that position, when the visible information matches the calculated expectation, the driver has confirmation that they are where they think they are. When it does not match, when the road feels like it is curving in a direction that memory says it shouldn't be, that is the signal to slow down, stop if necessary, and reassess before proceeding. Stopping is itself a navigation decision that carries its own risks, and it is worth understanding why. On the Dalton, a stopped truck in a whiteout is a potential hazard to every truck behind it, because those drivers also have limited or no visibility and may not see a stationary vehicle until they are dangerously close. The CB radio protocol for a forced stop requires an immediate broadcast of position and reason, in enough detail that following drivers can begin slowing before they would otherwise need to. Drivers describe this as calling the stop, and the discipline around it is part of the training that operating on extreme routes requires. On roads with more traffic, stop protocols are handled by physical signage, flashing lights, emergency systems. On the Dalton, in a storm, they are handled by human communication, the way maritime navigation was handled before radar, by voice, by mutual awareness, by collective professional practice. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline System carries crude oil from Prudhoe Bay south to Valdez, roughly 800 miles through terrain that is, for most of its length, as remote and extreme as the Dalton itself. The oil moves because trucks move the equipment to build and maintain the pipeline. The trucks keep moving because drivers who understand this specific environment continue doing a job that most people in the lower 48 states don't know in any detail exists. When the cargo is food, it is food for the North Slope workers who maintain the oil fields. When it is fuel, it is the diesel that keeps generators running in communities above the Arctic Circle through temperatures that would kill an unprotected person in minutes. When it is equipment parts, it is the hardware that keeps the pipeline pumping and the lights on across a region that has no alternative supply chain. The weight of that responsibility shapes how drivers on this route approach every decision, including navigation decisions. A driver who loses the road and drives off the edge in a whiteout doesn't just risk their own life. They block the road for every truck behind them. They spill cargo that may be irreplaceable on the schedule it was moving on. They require rescue resources to be deployed from the nearest point, which on the North Slope coastal plain may be dozens of miles away, into conditions that are already dangerous. The consequence of a navigation failure is not proportional to the driver's skill or experience. It is proportional to the environment, and the environment on the coastal plain in a full Arctic storm is one of the most unforgiving on Earth. This is what makes the navigation question so much more than a technology problem. It would be satisfying to say that better GPS, more sophisticated mapping software, or autonomous vehicle systems could solve what drivers on the Dalton face when the road disappears. And technology does help. The Delineator project represents real engineering that addresses real conditions. Dispatch systems provide real-time location data that gives carriers and safety managers visibility into where their drivers are, even when those drivers cannot see where they are going. Weather reporting systems help dispatchers make better decisions about when to clear trucks for departure. and when to hold them at cold foot or dead horse while conditions improve. All of that is real and meaningful, but the navigation that happens in the cab at 5 miles per hour in a full whiteout on the Arctic coastal plain is still primarily a human act. It is a driver reading the road through their feet and hands as much as their eyes, integrating CB traffic about conditions 5 miles ahead, tracking elapsed time since the last landmark they recognized, watching for delineator posts in the headlights, and deciding, every few seconds, whether it is safer to keep moving or safer to stop. That is not a decision an algorithm makes well. It is a decision that requires the specific embodied knowledge of someone who has run this road in these conditions before, who knows what the truck feels like when it is drifting left toward drainage on the approach to mile 390, who knows how long it should take between the last pipeline support structure and the first lights of the Dead Horse compound if you are moving at 10 miles per hour. Who knows that the wind comes from a slightly different angle on this stretch of the plain than it does on the one they just left. There is one more element to navigation in extreme conditions on the Dalton that is almost never discussed, and it sits at the intersection of the physical and the human in a way that is worth spending a moment with. Experienced drivers talk about the way extreme low visibility driving changes their relationship to time. When you can see clearly, time is organized by distance. You can see 2 miles ahead. You know what's coming in 4 minutes. You make decisions with that cushion of information. When visibility drops to a truck length or less, time compresses. You are making decisions based on what is directly in front of you and what your memory tells you should be there. And the future, the next 100 feet of road, is completely unknown until you are almost on top of it. Drivers describe this as living in a very small window, and the mental effort of sustaining that kind of compressed, fully present attention over hours of driving in storm conditions is exhausting in a way that ordinary fatigue does not capture. It is not the tiredness of driving too long. It is the tiredness of demanding absolute focus from a nervous system that is simultaneously managing cold, darkness, isolation, and the knowledge that any lapse in that focus could have consequences that cannot be undone. And yet they keep going, not because they are indifferent to the risk, but because the cargo has to arrive, because the oil fields need fuel, because the workers at Prudhoe Bay need food and supplies, because somewhere in the chain of events that begins with a driver leaving Fairbanks in the dark and ends with lights staying on and equipment staying warm above the Arctic Circle, there is a choice being made at every mile marker to continue rather than stop. The drivers who have made this road their profession understand that choice in a way that most people will never need to, and they have built the skills to execute it in conditions that most people will never face. The next time you see a truck moving through weather that has made you pull over and wait, understand that somewhere much further north, on a road that does not look like the roads you know, a driver may be navigating through conditions that make your storm look calm. They are doing it with their hands, their memory, their radio, and the knowledge that the only thing that reliably remains when the road disappears is the skill of the person looking for it. Because finding a road that isn't there to see is only one part of the challenge these drivers face. In the next episode, we'll go somewhere the danger isn't invisible, where it is very clearly visible, moving fast and advancing toward the truck from multiple directions at once. Wildfire season on trucking corridors creates decisions and survival techniques that are unlike anything in Arctic trucking. And what happens when a driver has to calculate whether the smoke ahead is passable or whether the route behind them has already closed? That story is coming next.